Erev Tov, everyone. Really excited. So tonight we actually have a fairly short class. There's not a lot of sources here, but I hope the topic is very interesting and enlightening if you're not familiar with this. And then what we'll do is after the formal part of the class, I will open it up to questions and answers about Purim, about some of the customs, the laws, etc., like that. And we'll make some space for that. But the background behind this class, something called Purim Katan, or you might see it called Second Purim in English, is the idea that what's the Purim we all know? The famous Purim we all know is during the time of the Babylonian exile in this town in ancient Persia called Shushan. And the story of the king there, Ahasuerus, that was convinced by the evil Haman. And if you're familiar with the Disney movie Aladdin, he's basically the Jafar, the evil person whispering in the ear. And in fact, if you watch any HBO fantasy film, there's always an evil person whispering in the ear of the king, convincing him to do terrible things. Exactly what happens here, but thank God, through a series of what's not luck, but we believe to be divinely either inspired or just divinely set up events, the Jewish people, through Esther more than anything, but really Mordecai as well, are able to convince the king to let the Jews survive and actually defend themselves against Haman. There's obviously more nuances to the story, but regardless, this community clearly had something miraculous. They survived a possible tragedy. They survived a genocide, and not a single one of them was killed. And there's no question that they want to celebrate that. And that very idea about celebrating something you survived is something which is said explicitly in the Talmud. So before we get into the meat of this class, let's actually look at that first source there. So Lindsay, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. So this first source here is actually talking about the prayer of Hallel, which is a series of Psalms, but it's very relevant to ultimately what Purim represents and the very idea behind Purim and Hanukkah and other such holidays. So please, source number one.
And the rabbis say that Hallel was not established for any specific event, but the prophets among them instituted that the Jewish people should recite it on every appropriate occasion and for every trouble. May it not come upon the Jewish people. When they are redeemed, they recite it over their redemption.
Excellent. So whenever the Jewish people are saved, we should recite Hallel. We should celebrate it as a special time. So Hanukkah, we do it. On Pesach, when certainly the biggest redemption ever out of slavery for hundreds of years, we recite Hallel. Now, even though this is not the main part of the class, just one little side, because you're going to ask a question. Rabbi, you're starting the whole class about talking how on Purim we were saved, and the rabbis say that when you're saved, you say Hallel. Except tomorrow, as I'm unmuting you, do we say Hallel on Purim?
No.
We don't. So that's source number two, which again, not the main focus of the class, but it's just an interesting insight, and then we'll get into the meat. So please, Tamar, source number two.
If so, why don't we recite Hallel as well? Rabbi Nachman stated the reading of the Megillah is Purim's Hallel. Rava stated it makes sense to recite Hallel on Pesach and say the servants of God sing praise, and not the servants of Pharaoh. However, here regarding Purim, the servants of God sing praise, and not the servants of Ahasuerus. We are still servants of Ahasuerus.
That last point there is that when we were redeemed from Egypt, we were completely redeemed. We no longer had any foreign king over us. It was an absolute, complete, again, redemption from servitude to a foreign king who oppressed us, therefore Hallel. Whereas on Purim, even though we were freed from the utter evil, and again, Haman wanted to commit a genocide against our people in that entire land of Shushan, we were freed from that, but we're still under a foreign king. So it's not a complete redemption. But the point here is this, that when the Jewish people, a town, a city, a country, is saved through a miracle of God, and they see it themselves as a miracle of God, they should recognize it in some ways, whether it's the recitation of Hallel, which there's a whole class I gave on those who say Hallel on Israeli Independence Day, or in Yom Yerushalayim, remembering the incredible, truly miraculous victory of the 1967 Six-Day War. On Purim, we don't say Hallel, but we do recite a text, Megillat Esther, to celebrate it, and we have all these mitzvot about it. So having established that very clear principle that when something amazing happens, not even to the whole Jewish world, we're not talking about, it doesn't just have to be Pesach and Egypt. It doesn't have to be Hanukkah and the temple. Anytime a town is saved from a great tragedy, we should memorialize it. So one question is, why is it that the holiday of Purim, specifically for the town of Shushan, became representative for the entire Jewish people? And it might have been that the rabbis, it was a huge community. The rabbis were inspired by it. They wanted to, this is the first time they wanted to establish the idea that there are miracles even after the times of miracles, that God can still be present even though we don't see that. Because in the times of the Second Temple, the rabbis explicitly say a lot of those miraculous things that they say happened in the time of the First Temple, about the sacrifices being, swallowed up and all these amazing things, those didn't happen anymore. The times of the prophets were over. Ezra, Nehemiah, it's over. But Purim establishes that miracles can still happen if you're able to see them. That's the power of Purim in Shushan. But the other idea they established is, why can't you have other Purims? What if there's a town in the middle of Ohio that the Jewish people there face a great tragedy, something traumatic, and they survive through a miracle of God? Shouldn't they celebrate it too? Maybe even with Hallel or reading their own story? And that indeed is what has happened for almost 1,000 years, is there is not just one Purim. There are dozens and dozens of Purims. In fact, what I'll actually do is, I was going to say this at the end, but I'll just show this. This is a partial list. There's a much, much longer list. Every single one of these towns, Algiers, in the year 1540, and it gives, the reason. This is from the Encyclopedia Judaica. There was a potential destruction. Now, again, there's longer versions of this because what these towns all did, Cavaillon in Provence in 1631, and you have Breche, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, in Champagne, France, 1191. So we're really going back a long time. And this goes all over the world, communities all over the world, when they were saved. And here, it's not even necessarily a potential genocide. There was a big fire in the town. There was a danger of war. There were riots. There was somebody who was attacking Jews. All of these things, including individual families that might have been accused of something. And then with all of the anti-Semitism in their town, you were sure that the patriarch of that family would end up in jail, dead, or worse, whatever that could mean. And then somehow they got off scot-free. And that never happened. All of these turned into Purims. And you look here on the column saying observed. It's not on Adar. It's whenever it happened. So you have towns where they're basically creating their own holidays all over the place. And it's beautiful. And they all mark it in different ways, with mitzvot, to give charity, to have meals, to send gifts to each other like Mishloach Manot. They write their own Megillot. They write their own scrolls to tell these stories. Now, the reality is that a lot of these practices have fallen away, partly because the Jews of those towns aren't there anymore. They've married off, they moved away. Some of the families that had individual customs, those families are no longer around. But the very idea that we can and really should try to see miracles in our everyday lives, and when it's truly great, and it doesn't need to be the saving of the entire nation, we can mark it on the calendar. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's the big source that we'll look at in a moment. So some of you may even say, you know what? In 1999, our family faced a great tragedy, and it kind of was a miracle that we survived. Maybe every year on March 12th or April 7th, we should have a little party. We should tell the story. We should have a meal, and we should thank God for it. Because when someone survives a journey or a surgery, they go into synagogue and they say Birkat HaGomel, they say a blessing thanking God. But if it's truly something big that affects your whole family or your whole town, make a big deal out of it, because what it does is it brings God into your life. And it causes you to have gratitude for God in a very direct way. Because when we say thank you to God on Pesach, it's beautiful, but it's hard to connect to that. But if I can talk about how my grandfather, Olav Shalom, came over to the States and was welcomed in and survived pogroms, or my grandfather was hid under floorboards in Russia and he survived that, that makes it very, very real. And that's why Purim shouldn't just be kept to one place. It could and perhaps should extend to families, because it makes it very personal. So what we'll look at now is the last big source. And Jane, I will have you read this one. So this is the Chaye Adam, Rabbi Abraham Danzig, 18th century Poland. So it's relatively recent, but he is considered by many to kind of be the, is it okay to create your own Purim? And even though this is much later and people have been doing it, for 800 years at this point. He's seen as authoritative in this. And even though people may not know him as much, he is still one of the single most important works on practical Jewish law for Ashkenazi Jewry today. He was kind of supplanted by other bigger works, but he's still incredibly important in the study of Jewish law. So go ahead, please, Jane.
Whoever has had a miracle occur for them, and all the more so the inhabitants of the city, can establish by popular agreement for themselves and those who come after them to make that day into a Purim. And it seems to me that the meal which they make to commemorate the miracle is considered at the level of a seudat mitzvah, meal with halachic weight. So too do we practice regarding the miracle which was performed for us in the year 5564, the night of the 16th of Kislev. There was a death in the courtyard in which I live because of a conflagration which started from gunpowder. Several houses in the courtyard fell, including one house that was mine. In the room where my whole family was located, 2 half walls and 1 beam fell. Not a single one, in other words, member of the family, did not shed at least some drops of blood. God in his mercy and kindness considered for us the blood like a sacrifice to atone and saved us, and all of us remained alive. Even though I suffered a great loss of several hundred adumim, God in his kindness substituted blood for money, literally damim for damim. Aside from us, there were killed in our many sins in my courtyard 31 people. And in order to tell of the wonders of God, as it is written in Tehillim, he created a memorial for his wonders. I have accepted upon myself and my descendants, without vowing, on the 16th of Kislev, since in our land it is already a day of fasting in many communities for the Chaver Kadisha who do kindness, to devote at least half of it for God, and whoever can should fast. And on the following night, immediately after Ma'ariv, they should gather and light candles like on Yom Tov and sing the Shir HaYichud slowly and pleasantly, and the Shir HaKavod with song, and afterwards recite chapters of Psalms slowly. And after this, to make a meal for those who learn Torah and to give charity in accordance with the blessing of God as much as one can afford.
Excellent, thank you. There's a lot of beautiful things here, and this is very powerful. This is a personal tragedy that I went through, and one of the things to point out at the beginning, he said, Misha lo nes v'kol sheken b'nei ir. He says that even an individual person who is in, something happens to him, he has a miracle done for him, and all the more so a town. So even if one individual Jew has something miraculous, and I think if we went around here, many of us could say, you know what, if I actually think about it, something incredible did happen to me in my life, and I was saved from a great possible tragedy, and it was really close. He says that person, and he doesn't say must, he doesn't say it's a mitzvah to do so, but he says that person can establish for themselves basically a new holiday. But there's an interesting subtlety here. He uses the language of bli neder, without a vow, because there's this idea that we don't create new holidays. We don't want to establish new holidays. Only the rabbis of yore could do that, and that becomes a conversation around Israeli Independence Day and establishing a new holiday. Now, most, certainly modern Orthodox rabbis, including myself, feel that when it's certainly such a massive miracle for really the whole Jewish people in the land of Israel, establishing a holiday is really appropriate, in saying Hallel, that's what it was created for. But the idea of an individual family creating for themselves all these beautiful customs with fasting and then eating and saying set prayers, and I cut out here with the ellipse, he listed all the Psalms. He really established for his family something that touched them and traumatized them in a very, very direct way. And one of the reasons that this idea is so important is because it gets to the idea of how we remember what happened to us as a people. And the reason I say it that way is this Shabbat is the Shabbat Zachor. It's when we read a few lines from the book of Dvarim, Deuteronomy chapter 25. It's when the Israelites were leaving the land of Egypt, and the Amalekites, which are actually distant cousins, a distant related tribe, attacked us when we were at our most vulnerable. And it is a mitzvah in the Torah to remember that traumatic attack. But the way we remember that is to remind ourselves of the trauma and to commit ourselves to wiping out the evil that is Amalek everywhere. But in this story, when, his house almost burnt down and everyone was damaged, they remember it with joy and gratitude towards God. And that, I think, is the uniqueness of the Jewish people, about how we have both components of memory. We talk about the Holocaust, talk about never again. That is an active command, an active call to action to try and fight injustice, to try and prevent genocide, even though it still happens all over the world. But the question is, when we remember surviving a trauma or a trauma that did happen, do you remember it with vengeance and anger, or do you remember it with joy and gratitude? And I think those nuances and those tensions about how we deal with remembering trauma help define the Jewish people, because the reality is we have both. We have holidays like Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. We remember the day with sadness. And I don't think anger necessarily, but it's more with negative emotions. But then we have Hanukkah, where they tried to slaughter us and we fought back, and we remember that with great joy. And that's what defines our people, is how we remember everything, the good and the bad, and we memorialize it appropriately. And that's exactly what Purim is. Purim is the rabbis setting up the model for saying that this town survived, and you can't forget this town. You may not be from this town, but it matters. It matters that God is part of our world. It matters that miracles happen. And that's why this idea of a Purim Katan, even though it's kind of fallen out of practice, is still very appropriate. And again, any of you who say, you know what, Rabbi, could I every year on, again, with June 10th or whatever, remember that Rabbi Dinan was born, and that's the most joyous day, that's my birthday, whatever it is, or if there's a traumatic event and one wants to remember that. Again, all of these things are important to Jewish identity, is not just how we remember, but that we try and remember everything, because it's our memories that make us who we are. But then what makes us Jewish and really unique is, what do we do with that memory? Does it turn us bitter, or does it make us proactive? Because the call of Tisha B'Av is not just sadness, it's how do we rebuild? How do we prevent that internal hatred? How do we make sure that the temple and the unity of the Jewish people comes back? Again, with Zahorat Amalek, how do we fight against evil internally and externally? So whether or not you start your own Purim, the beauty of this, and again, you can go online and see there's stories and videos describing these towns. There's the one known as the Purim of Bandits. There's all these kind of cool ones and all over the world. And literally there are dozens of them. And for all I know, some of your families may do something like this. But that is the power of the Jewish people. We remember everything, and then it informs us and it empowers us. So before we go on to our Q&A, any questions just on this short topic that we explored tonight?
Yeah, I have one.
Yeah, Jane, please.
So I find it a little troubling that he makes a thing on his family surviving when the other people in the community did not. I find that bothersome.
Well, say more about that.
Well, he says aside from us, there were killed in our many sins in my courtyard 31 people. So 31, his immediate family, say the nuclear family, did not die. Everyone was saved, and that's wonderful. That's terrific.
Yeah.
But 31 people died. So to make a holiday out of it, I find troublesome. I'm sorry.
No, and I hear that. And I think that with the Holocaust, there's something called survivor's guilt. The people who did survive, and why did I survive and no one else did? And I think that's a really important question about when somebody survives something very, very traumatic. Are they allowed to show grateful and say, thank God that I didn't die? And here, I don't know, if reading between the lines, if he sees this as a day of great celebration. Like, again, Hanukkah is pure celebration. Purim is pure celebration, pure joy, because everybody was really saved. Here, there's a bittersweetness to it. But I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I mean, I don't think you're wrong. And I'm not saying, oh, that's not the way to look at it. But I think there's two sides to it, because just because an event wasn't everybody saved doesn't mean a person can't show their gratitude. And also for them, it wasn't like they were out of town. And then they heard there was a fire and many people died, and some people survived. They almost died. And I think that's a really important thing. This struck very, very close to home. And I think this is, again, that tension of Jews celebrating on any holiday. and tempering it. All of the celebration, all the joy we have is constantly tempered with the fact that so many Jews have suffered. The fact that, throughout the year, here's an example, is when a Jew builds a house or does major renovation, there's a practice of not completing that. They're painting their entire house to leave one section of it unpainted. Why? Because the temple's been destroyed. So even though they're so excited to work on their house, they recognize that the Jewish people still went through a trauma and it's still lingering and it stays with us. So even in the greatest joy, it's always tempered. So he does here actually talk about, fasting. And I think that's, that like with Esther, even though Esther in the story fasted as a way of praying to God, the fast of Esther is also kind of a recognizing the suffering and the fear and the anxiety of the Jews before they were saved by God. So I think there has to be a balance there. I don't think it's inappropriate for him to make a holiday out of it because his family was saved, and that's to be grateful for. But my sense here is that it is tempered a little bit by the loss of those lives, and I think he does honor those lives. But again, your question is so complex and nuanced. How can we ever celebrate? If we'll only celebrate when everybody's happy, how can we ever have joy? And there are people that you don't get birthday presents on your birthday unless everyone in the world has birthday presents. And because there's so many people in poverty, we won't celebrate. We're not going to eat a birthday cake until everyone in the world has a birthday cake. Now, that's an extreme view, but I absolutely heard things like that. How can we ever be truly happy unless everyone's happy? But the human experience is to find joy despite that. And the fact is, in his piece here, he makes a major point of noting the people who did die. The part of the story is those who didn't survive. When they recount it in God's gratitude, that's part of their story too. Not everyone survived, but thank you, God, that we were able to. So really such a great question, Jane, and I don't think there's a right answer to it. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on it.
No, I haven't thought about a Purim Katan from our days, and that's the synagogue that was attacked by the gentleman and then was talked down, and the rabbi was able to make sure that nobody was hurt. That would make for a good day for me.
And I think that's a beautiful idea, and I imagine some of these shuls on the anniversary do make things like that, or what happened in Squirrel Hill. I know when that Shabbat came around, synagogues all over the world, kind of like Purim, even though it was nowhere near us, didn't directly affect us at all. It was a small portion of the Jewish community. The fact is, one Jew anywhere is all Jews everywhere. And we mark that. Now, as I said, a lot of these Purim Katans, a lot of these second Purims, over time, again, the communities, they kind of wear off, those families disappear, those towns disappear. So a lot of these things that for 2 years will memorialize a synagogue that was attacked or saved, and eventually it peters out. But again, that's something Jews do. We try and memorialize stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised with all of the horrific gun violence if synagogues around the world don't decide to have one day to memorialize all those who were killed in our days from gun violence, and then maybe a day after that to celebrate the heroes and the strength of synagogues to survive. I think that's what often happens. I think that's why Purim is as big as it is. It's sort of become a catch-all for all of those little towns, for all of those times that God makes miracles that are not apparent. But again, the reality is any town, person, or family could make a little Purim, and there's nothing wrong with that. The Chaim Adam may say, don't say, God, I swear we're going to do this every year, because you don't want to create a full mitzvah. But if you want to make it a family commemoration and tell of it, and from my in-laws at their Pesach Seder, my wife's grandparents were both survivors. They actually met in a camp, in a men's and women's work camp side by side. And the telling of the Holocaust and their story, their melodies, etc., is so deeply enmeshed in their Pesach Seder. So it's not the same as a Purim Katan, but it's that very idea, because it takes our existing rituals and it adds, again, this personal connection and layer. And I think that's the beauty of Judaism, and the future of Judaism is to continue to add our own rituals and our own stories to keep the previous stories going.